Hello and welcome to a special edition of Crossing Channels, the podcast which brings together the interdisciplinary strengths of the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge and the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse. I'm Rory Cellan-Jones, and today's special episode sees us come together with our colleagues at the Kyiv School of Economics in Ukraine. We would like to extend our strongest support to everyone in Ukraine at the moment, and in particular to our colleagues in academia, policy and journalism who are working through this crisis. This episode has the title, The Ukraine Invasion, Context, Consequences and the Information War. To explore these issues today, we are very lucky to be joined by Nataliia Shapoval from the Kyiv School of Economics. Nataliia, thank you so much for joining us at this time. Can you tell us briefly, first of all, what you work on, what your main research interests are?
Hello, everyone. So I'm head of a local think tank in Ukraine. I work on all kinds of areas that are policy relevant during a certain period of time. Mostly these are healthcare. I work on financial protection of citizens in Ukraine and in developing countries, on public procurement and whatever reform our government is doing at the moment.
To discuss the conflict with Nataliia, we have Horacio Larreguy from the IAST. Horacio, can you remind us of your main research interests?
Yeah, so I'm an economist and political scientist that works in political economy and economic development. Prior to the pandemic, I had a lot of work focusing on the importance of information, mostly that disseminated via social media for accountability. But post-pandemic, essentially, I've been using the tools I was employing for those questions and trying to understand much more the impact of misinformation and, importantly, like different ways to counter it.
So misinformation obviously going to be a key theme in our discussions because there is an information war going on. And our final guest is Ayse Zarakol from the University of Cambridge. Ayse, what do you focus on?
Hello, I'm a professor of international relations, and among other things, I work on East-West relations from a historical perspective. And most recently, I'm the author of Before the West, which came out yesterday. So,
Thank you very much. Obviously, I'd like to start by asking Nataliia a simple and pretty obvious question. What is life like in Ukraine for you right now, for you, your colleagues and families?
So I left Kiev, the capital city where I lived on 21st of February. We woke up from the airstrikes in Kiev and went out of the city with my husband and several of our relatives. My team, which is around 50 people, 50 analysts, some of them stayed in Kiev and still stayed there. Some of them were mobilized, so they voluntarily joined the military forces the first day of the war. And with most of our team, we have still connection, even those who are fighting in the military or in territorial defense units. In general, the country can be divided into two parts. One part is where the active military action is going on, like Kiev or Kharkiv or Donetsk or Odessa or Sumy. In these regions, there are very huge problems with everything. They mostly are disconnected from electricity, heating, gas, have water supply problems. Some cities are distracted completely, and people are being evacuated to the degree the system can cope with that. But then there is another part of the country which is mostly western and central Ukraine. And in this part, business is working. There are no kinds of huge economic issues, so everything is working. Of course, on all territory of Ukraine, there are military forces, territorial defense units. On the roads, you would have posts. Everyone is being checked what's going on. In every city and village, mobilization is going on. Soldiers are being sent to different locations. Near the borders of Ukraine, in the west, there are long queues for transport and for people because some are trying to relocate, some are trying to get back. Some people are very much okay, like I am. I relocated from my flat, and I have only like one sweater and one pair of shoes with me, but I never I'm okay. I always lived like that. But for some people, it's much more difficult because they did not have savings. They have relatives that cannot move or who have very serious diseases, and they are totally in different situation. Many families had to send their men to military forces. So in general, that's how it looks right now.
And is your academic work continuing? Obviously, you're a whole group of academics who've got a great track record of analysing policy and so on. Are you able in any way to see this through an academic lens? Because it must be very difficult. For instance, had you any view about whether this was likely to happen? Did it come as a huge surprise? Can you analyse what Putin has done and is likely to do?
So we work as analysts right now too, trying to contribute to winning in this war. For example, we do monitoring of all kinds of damages that Russia done to Ukraine to calculate all the costs and make them pay the bill every penny. We follow sanctions, and every day we propose new ideas about the sanctions. We also trying to look into supply chains that can be disrupted and how that could be replaced, into some global issues that can happen like food security. We were analyzing what's going to happen and how to prevent it. Of course, it's not the academic depths, and it's something that you can come up with during the day or during a few hours, but that's the only thing that we can do, push the buttons on the computer, make tables in Excel. We also try to collaborate with our partner institutions in US and in Europe and involve them into some questions. And we try to participate in as many conferences and events about the war to bring the perspective of Ukrainian people into the discussion and give Ukraine more agency, because there are many frustrating things for us in how this question is being covered of the war.
Tell me about that. What are your frustrations?
Firstly, it's very frequently about Putin and Russia, and then about US and Europe, like Ukraine doesn't have agency here, which is of course not true. Secondly, what I really hate is when people start discussing Putin's strategy. That's also frustrating because, of course, killing people is a very easy thing to do, and there is no much strategy or something. He's just murderer, and he spent last 20 years to achieve what he have now and to enslave his people and build this autocratic regime. I don't think that people should call it strategy or something. It's just crime.
What is your aim in your research in trying to change that narrative? What kind of data are you trying to generate that will give a fuller, richer story of what is happening to the Ukraine people and the Ukraine economy?
Me personally, I'm trying to bring in perspective of humanity into that and tell that basically this is crime of Putin against Ukrainian people, and this should be punished accordingly. So it's just very humane dialogue with other people, and just sharing how it looks from here, and explaining that we are the same as they are. Me and my husband, we could well also live in US, so he's US professor. Actually, he teaches in Pittsburgh University. Then we are trying to explain, it's also not very academic thing, but just to explain that we stay here in Ukraine not because we are suffering or we need help or something, but explain that we just don't wanna give anybody right to decide instead of us whether we should leave or how we should think about. So it's more about general humanity than about some academic frameworks. My friend, who is a sociologist, he also brings as much as possible all kinds of sociological data to show how united and people in Ukraine are. For example, like almost 80% of Ukrainians think that Ukraine will win the war. And most of people in Ukraine are now for joining European Union. So all kinds of, sociological data that we try to bring in.
Nataliia, I want to focus on your experience as an economist and policymaker to get a sense of what happens in government during an extraordinary crisis like this. On this podcast, we talk about policy changes as a long, slow process which can take years to happen. Of course, that's not the case here. Things are changing so fast. In your experience over the last week even, what do governments do? What are their policy priorities? Are you seeing policy formed in front of your very eyes?
Yes, so the government and parliament and office of president, they are real heroes. Firstly, because they stay in the government buildings and don't leave that, despite of numerous reports from intelligence agencies about attempts of Putin to kill the president. And basically, the whole day communication is about some kind of denazification, which implies that people who are in politics should disappear somehow. Secondly, there are several fronts of work of the government. First is international relations, of course. So the office of the president and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they work 24/7 to talk to all international partners, propose sanctions, request all kinds of support. Then there is a front of internal work. It's led by the central bank, Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Economy. So the central bank is supporting macro-financial stability right now. The exchange rate is fine. The reserves of the bank are okay. They created special account to collect donations for the needs of the military. So there are all kinds of macroprudential regulations, and they are being changed in order to make it easier to donate to Ukraine in all kinds of currencies, etc. They also issued special military bonds for internal markets to collect money for the needs of the military forces of Ukraine.
So you're painting a picture of the economy working surprisingly well, given this huge shock.
This is true, or partially true, of course. On the one hand, for example, prices are stable, but then in some places there is nothing that you can buy with this money. But policy making is very timely, very appropriate, and there are changes every day. They come up with new ideas that respond to the problems that emerge.
I suppose in normal times, academics like you, economists in particular, would have a very kind of objective view and often a critical view of government policy. But is there a feeling now that that just would not be appropriate, that you're all in this together, your job is more to lend support to the government in every way possible?
That's a very good comment. Of course, my work as a think tank is to evaluate what the government is doing, make some proposals. Some of my teammates are sometimes quite critical about what the government and the president office are doing. But right now, I guess the general feeling in Ukraine is that we all are impressed with how well the government is responding to the situation, and we all are impressed with the behavior of the president, with his courage, and with how capable he is of telling the truth to all these big guys in US, in Russia, and everywhere. So it's not, the consideration of whether it's appropriate or not. It's just we genuinely are respect what's being done by them and trying to help in every way possible.
What impact do you think that it's very obviously it's ridiculously early to say this? What lasting impact is this war going to have on Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian society that would stay even if amazingly, the Russian troops were to just leave? Will there be lasting impacts?
I think the world will not be the same after this war in many respects. First, huge impact for the world for the upcoming year or maybe even several years is related to food security. Ukraine and Russia are about 1/3 of global market of wheat and corn and some agri products. And right now it's a period when farmers and agri holdings should be like doing all kind of planting seeds, putting fertilizers into the ground, and this is not happening either here and in Russia. It's also distorted, so there will be significant influence on the global market, not only in terms of prices but also through deficit. There are around 400 million people in the world that are like end users of Ukrainian agri products. They might not receive that. Some of the products can be substituted, but like wheat can be substituted by rice, for example. But then food for animals that are brought for meat, it's not that easily substitutable. So there will be all kinds of effect. Then energy market in Ukraine and in Europe in general will change, maybe to better, because I think the world will not allow Russia to have such a leverage on the natural gas market and oil market as they had before. It was so ironic that just before the war, during the whole winter, Russia was charging several times higher price for the natural gas from Europe just to create the reserves for the central bank and have enough liquidity to conduct the war. It's so like stupid to be in this situation right now, and I think it will change. All countries will diversify, and Ukraine will become like independent with our energy resources. That's for sure.
Ayse Zarakol, how does this all change Ukraine's standing? I mean, obviously, extraordinary support for Ukraine. Does that persist in your view?
I think so, yes, to some extent. This has made an impression on Western publics in a way that other, even previous conflicts in Ukraine haven't. So I think that's going to be remembered, and there's going to be. I mean, of course, there is material pain and real suffering, but in the long term, I think it will help Ukraine's standing in the international community, and there will be some good things maybe to come out of this period of suffering for Ukraine.
I'd like to move the conversation on to what is one extraordinary factor in this, the information war. And Horacio Larreguy, this is your specialism. You've had a look at, particularly during the pandemic, the epidemic of misinformation. What are you observing about who's winning that information war? I saw an article in the Financial Times, I think, this week, stating that this was one area where Ukraine was definitely winning. Is that your assessment?
So certainly, it's important to point out that this is not new, because of social media. Misinformation is very widespread, but this is common to every war. For example, when shortly after rising to power, Hitler created the Reich Ministry of Enlightenment and Propaganda. So you have a sense of, and so this strategy has been used in history in every war, mostly to pit people against each other and to destabilize government. So I think that those are the two key components that are also here. And I think there are two parts that I think that are important. So I think there are two important distinctions when it comes to misinformation. One is kind of the misinformation towards Ukraine, and the one's basically towards Russia. And even within Ukraine, you can split it again between two, sort of those essentially towards kind of the Russian minorities. So essentially, when it comes to the misinformation towards the Russians sort of in Ukraine, especially a strategy to try to destabilize the government by saying that it's like a Nazi government and they were committing all these atrocities towards the Russian minorities. I think that in that sense, that clearly that seems that that war and misinformation sort of has been lost. It's not really obvious though that the Russians are sort of or I would say I like to say the Kremlin rather than the Russians, because I'm not sure like they necessarily represent the majority of the people. But I think that the Kremlin clearly has done a pretty good job so destabilizing sort of the insurgent areas, and sort of it's not that people decided one day to raise in arms. Sort of we have since the end of the Cold War, the Kremlin has been extremely active in propaganda and disinformation and misinformation strategies to really try to create a buffer. And I think in that sense, like the fact that we have some support from within Ukraine for the Russian troops to enter and sort of in a quote unquote justified way, they kind of won on that sense, and it's kind of too late by now.
The fascinating thing about the information war within Russia, the Russian government to its own people, because we're used to hearing that misinformation is massively spread on social media and mainstream media has less of it. It seems in this case, it's the other way around, that the misinformation channel is kind of state TV in Russia. And the only hope of Russian people getting access to more accurate information is via social media. Is that fair?
The Russian misinformation sort of apparatus, it's a massive thing that goes beyond just the state media. There's a lot of monitoring from like DBank.EU and also like NewsGuard in the States and sort of in many places. It's just impressive the amount of misinformation narratives they have created for like different purposes. So I don't think, unfortunately, that it's just restricted to state media. Of course, this is a big component, and they have an important control of that. But essentially, I think that it's pretty big. And actually, and what's sad here is I think it's somewhat effective. And it's not clear, that we're winning that war. It's kind of hard to get a good grasp from like kind of Western media on kind of what's going on within Russia. But if you talk to people that have family over there and also academics, like things are pretty polarized. It's not the case that everybody's totally against the war. I think that there has been a lot of narratives about kind of the threat of Ukraine joining NATO and how that was affecting sort of Russia. Narratives about like genocide of Russians by the Ukrainian government. I think essentially there's been a lot of work that has been done on the misinformation front to gather some support that I think is still present, and sort of we have to see how the war evolves. But I think in that front, at least we're not winning. I'm sure we're losing, but it's not clear that what's going to happen.
Ayse, you wanted to come in there.
Yes, I just had something to add, which is that this question of why some Russians still support Kremlin or support the invasion, to the extent that they even know it's happening or whatever they think is happening.
The word invasion, the word war is actually banned by
yes.
the Russian media.
The support it's not just misinformation. I think it's important to realize it is a kind of misinformation, but Kremlin usually uses various historical grievances that have some basis in fact and points to examples of Western hypocrisy, etc. So building kind of a misinformation narrative around things that people can generally agree on, and then it becomes very difficult to know what's real, what's happening now, what's in the past. There's kind of a blurring of different like layers of truth and misinformation. I think that's important to realize.
Nataliia, what's your view on how this information war is going from a Ukrainian point of view? Is your government being successful in kind of combating this Russian narrative?
I think my government is very effective on the global arena and very effective in getting the messages about how important military support is now, sanctions, and mobilizing international community. At the same time, I don't think that anyone is effective against Russian propaganda, because my perspective is that Putin has been working on creating mindset of many people in Russia for years. Like, as an example, there are priests in churches that draw on these spiritual paintings, they draw Putin.
On these icons?
Yes, on icons. That's kind of, it's not about social media or any specific channel. It is the systemic effort. The same is happening in all kind of law enforcement agencies. For example, my father-in-law, he is in some kind of Russian military forces, and he sends to our family, to Ukraine, videos about Ukrainian protests, saying that you all are Nazis and you all should die. And it cannot be contributed to one kind of to media or anything. It's just very systemic, and it cannot be reversed.
And this is your own family, in effect,
Yes.
divided by this.
Yeah, that's really, it's striking how far can person brain be out of from reality. I didn't think that it's even possible, but yeah, that's how it is.
Let's look at this conflict from a broader perspective with you, Ayse Zarakol, who you specialise in East-West relations. Was this predictable? How does it fit in with the kind of post-Cold War history?
For the most part, international relations experts recently did not expect an invasion of the scale. There was some expectation of something happening similar to what happened previously, maybe an Eastern incursion or something like that. What's taken most people by surprise is the fact that the whole country is targeted. So that's come as a surprise to most, I think, IR experts. Now, there is a school of thought in international relations called realism, and